Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are jumping right into a seriously fascinating historical investigation. We're going to trace the unbelievable evolution of the deity right at the center of the world's largest religions. We're talking about how a localized tribal entity transformed, over millennia, into the universal singular God worshipped by billions of people today. It's a wild ride, so let's get into it.
So it really begs the question, who exactly was Yahweh before global monotheism even existed, right? I mean, we usually think of this figure as having always been the sole creator of the cosmos. But the historical and archaeological records, they tell a much more complex, deeply evolutionary story. Actually, this deity emerged straight out of the sands of Bronze Age obscurity.
Now, to actually understand this evolution, we've got to first define the theological landscape of the ancient world. See, the ancient Near East was defined by henotheism and monolatry, not pure monotheism. Henotheism is basically the belief in a single God, sure, but while totally accepting that other deities exist and rule over their own nations. Monolatry takes that just a step further. It demands exclusive loyalty to one God, even if he acknowledges the others are real. Keep this crucial framework in the back of your mind as we go forward, all right?
Part 1. The Southern Desert Origins.
Okay, so our earliest historical clues don't actually come from where you might think. They come from ancient Egyptian topographical texts dating all the way back to the 14th century BCE, specifically from the reign of Amenhotep III. These are literally enemies lists, and they describe a group called the Shasu of Yawu. So the Shasu were these semi-nomadic pastoralists, and honestly, often raiders, living down south in the regions of Seir and Edom. In this context, the name seems to function almost like a geographical marker tied to these desert nomads.
And this perfectly illustrates what scholars call the Kenite hypothesis. This is the theory that Yahweh was originally a Midianite or Kenite deity. And, the biblical narrative itself actually kind of hints at this. Think about it. When Moses flees to Midian, he meets Jethro, a Midianite priest. It's right there at a secret mountain of God in this southern desert where Moses and the early Israelites are first introduced to this deity. So the hypothesis basically suggests that the early Israelites adopted this southern God through these very desert encounters.
So the really absolutely crucial point here is that early primitive Yahwism was vastly different from what it would eventually become. We're talking about a highly localized warrior and storm deity of the desert. He was specifically associated with those terrifying, catastrophic flash floods that honestly still plague regions like Edom and Paran to this day. Then, when the massive societal upheaval known as the Bronze Age collapse hit, these nomadic worshippers migrated north into the Canaanite highlands, bringing their fierce desert storm god right into that huge power vacuum.
Moving on to Part 2. Merging with Father El.
Now take a look at this incredibly fascinating quote. It's from an older textual reading of Deuteronomy 32. It literally says that when Elion apportioned the nations, he fixed the boundaries according to the number of the Bnei Elohim, the sons of God. And Yahweh's own allotted portion was his people, Jacob. That means early poetic texts surprisingly depict Yahweh not as the supreme creator right off the bat, but originally as just one of the 70 sons of the Canaanite high god El Elyon, essentially receiving Israel as his allotted inheritance. Crazy, right?
But over time, as the cult grew, Yahweh essentially absorbed El's entire portfolio. Just look at the visual contrast here. On one hand, you have primitive Yahweh, a young, violent warrior god, associated with desert storms and raiding. On the other hand, Canaanite El, the elderly father of years, a totally wise, merciful creator god who presided over the divine council. The early Israelites basically merged these two very distinct deities together into one. Through this incredible corporate merger, as you could call it, Yahweh adopted a whole new set of traits straight from El. He gained supreme creator status, taking on the name Elohim. He took over El's divine council, whose members, by the way, were later kind of demoted and reinterpreted as angels. He acquired merciful and compassionate personality traits, which really softened his earlier warrior nature. Up in the Northern Kingdom, he even assimilated El's bull iconography. And archaeological inscriptions show he even temporarily adopted El's divine consort, the goddess Ashra. They actually found her cult objects placed in early Yahwistic shrines.
All right, Part 3. The Rivalry with Baal.
This was quite literally a storm god showdown. Both Yahweh and Baal were storm-riding warrior gods. It's like looking in a mirror. Yahweh controlled the desert thunderstorms, while Baal controlled the coastal winter rains. Yahweh dwelt on Mount Sinai, or Zion. Baal was up on Mount Zaphon. Both even had this mythic feat of defeating a massive, chaotic sea monster, Leviathan for Yahweh, Yam or Litanu for Baal. This fierce rivalry was totally driven by what psychologists call the narcissism of minor difference. They were simply way too similar to share the exact same region peacefully.
And that striking similarity, it resulted in some extreme cultic antagonism. Israelite prophets and kings waged relentless campaigns to completely eradicate Baal worship from the region. They were pushing for exclusive loyalty, remember that term, monolatry, to Yahweh alone. I mean, they hated Baal so much that scribes even engaged in a kind of taboo replacement, literally swapping Baal's name with the Hebrew word boshet, which means shame, right in their texts. One storm god had to go, and eventually the partisans of Yahweh completely wiped out Baal worship to establish total dominance.
Let's head into Part 4, Forging Global Monotheism.
So, tracking this macroevolution from a Bronze Age warrior to a syncretic Canaanite deity, we eventually hit this massive historical roadblock, the utter trauma of the 6th century BCE Babylonian exile. Think about it, without a nation, without a king, and without a temple, the religion literally had to adapt or die. To survive, Yahwism transformed entirely into a universal cosmic religion. It wasn't just that their god was the best god anymore, it was suddenly that he was the only god.
Now, scholars note that this theological evolution perfectly mirrored some massive socio-political changes happening at the same time. As the ancient Near East moved from a world of decentralized, constantly warring city-states into massive, centralized, universal empires like Babylon and Persia, the heavens were likewise consolidated. The emergence of a single, universal empire on Earth made the whole concept of a single, universal king over all the cosmos highly intuitive. It just made sense.
But check this out. Even after monotheism was definitively forged, the theological evolution didn't just stop. While the Orthodox views solidified Yahweh as the singular, totally benevolent creator, early Gnostic Christians actually completely inverted this. They reinterpreted him as the malevolent demiurge named Yaldabaoth. In their view, he was a fallen deity trying to imprison humans with false knowledge, creating an oppressive system that Jesus actually came to combat. It is a perfect illustration of how mythologies continually adapt, compete, and evolve based on changing historical and cultural contexts.
So, what should you really take away from this explainer? Hopefully, a profound sense of historical wonder. I mean, just ask yourself, if the Bronze Age collapse or the Babylonian exile hadn't happened exactly the way they did, would half the world today worship a completely different deity? If the unpredictable, chaotic dominoes of the ancient world had shifted just slightly, the entire religious landscape of our modern world might look entirely different. It just goes to show you, history and our absolute highest concepts of the divine are inextricably linked.